live. Remember, he has identified you as his own, guaranteeing that you will be saved on the day of redemption.
Thank you, Ken. And thank you, Ken Edstrom, for a beautiful prayer for our church. This is my third to last sermon. It's been an amazing journey and a really beautiful one. And I thank each one of you for making it a very special part of our life. You know, there are planned careers and then there are ones like mine. I've been thinking about today, the 8th and the 15th and the 22nd, and I'd like us to have a little bit of a theme regarding these 3 times together. I have about 100 minutes with you, and then I'm done. And I'd like us to really look at some connections between Sabbath, salvation, and healing, because I've come to realize that those 3 things are interchangeable. They're actually synonyms. They're symbols of one and the same thing, God's interest in us and his interest in providing for us rather than requiring things of us. You know, we are a family, aren't we? And every family has stories. Some of the stories are stories that are recounted frequently. They are part of legend. Other stories are almost never discussed. They're just kept in the background. My mother's life contained both types of stories that were part of the fabric of our family and others that were seldom spoken of. I'm the first person in 5 generations to not be born in British India. It's a country that doesn't exist anymore. It was split into Pakistan and India in 1947. So my mother actually lived longer than the country of her birth. And it was my grandfather's responsibility as a British police commissioner to supervise the partition. My mother was 21 years old when she first saw the ocean, when she hopped on a steamer and headed back home to England. She seldom spoke of the first 2 decades of her life. It was like as if they didn't exist. And there are only 2 times that I remember her actually speaking about these first 2 decades of her life. The first time was when we were watching a BBC documentary called The Jewel in the Crown. I don't know whether any of you remembered it or saw it, whether it was shown. It was a BBC documentary in the 80s, and it was a dramatic representation of the last few years of British India and the partition, the lead up to partition. My mother almost never watched television, but for those few days when they were showing The Jewel in the Crown, she was glued to the television set every night. And as she was watching, she was on the edge of her seat, and she would say, "I went to that school. We lived up the road from those people. We used to look after the Mountbatten's corgis when they used to go on vacation." She was living it. It was right there. I realized there was a whole part of my mother's life that I had no understanding of. The other time was more recently. I was working in Saudi Arabia with an American of Pakistani descent who used to write a newspaper column for one of the major newspapers in Pakistan. And I got chatting with him, and I mentioned that my mother had been born in Rawalpindi, which is now part of Pakistan. And he was desperate to interview my mother for his column in the newspaper. So I said, look, I'll put it together on one condition, that you blind copy me on your correspondence with my mother. I want to know about those times of her life as well. So he did, and it was an amazing thing to learn something about the first 2 decades of my mother's life. And I started to realize why she didn't say much about it. Some of the stories were horrendous. The violence leading up to the partition and at the time of partition and after partition are beyond our comprehension. We think of it as a beautiful, peaceful thing. It was not. My mother talked about the bloodshed and the rioting and the violence on the night of partition in Simla, where she was at Teacher Training College, and where she was taking one of their Muslim classmates and dressing her up as a man and then spiriting her out of the Indian part back to Pakistan. She also told stories of her father having to deal with the incredible violence around the times of the partition rallies. You know, we're all a product of our background, so you have to take this with a grain of salt. Here's a man who's part of the British Raj, but every time he used to hear of Gandhi being a man of peace, he would go, "Oh, man of peace," he said. "I used to have to go and arrange for the burning of the Hindu bodies and the burying of the Muslim bodies after a Gandhi rally." And he was telling a story about, my mother was telling a story about the relocation of the Hindus south and the Muslims north. So they had these huge trains that were running in the year prior, just relocating people. And one of the trains was heading south, full of Hindus, and it went past an outdoor mosque. Those of you that have travelled in certain parts of the world have probably seen this. It's something where the sides are parallel to, are pointing to Mecca, and you have lines, and people would just do their prayers there in these outdoor mosques. Somebody discharged a firearm off the train and apparently killed somebody at prayer, one of the Muslims at prayer. The Muslims got up from prayer and they ran to the train station and telegraphed the next train station and said, "Stop the train." Then they all ran to the train, making sure that no one could get off, and then systematically killed every man, woman, and child on the train. I started to realize why it was that my mother didn't speak about the first 2 decades of her life. Now, these are the stories that are seldom recounted, but there were other stories that were part of the fabric of who she was, and therefore who we were as a family. My mother was now back in Rawalpindi, and she was working teaching at an Anglican orphanage. My grandparents were devout Anglicans, and as such, they read the Bible every day as a family. And that had led them to read repeatedly through the book of Revelation. They knew what it said in the book of Revelation, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 3, that there was a blessing to those that read the book of Revelation. So there they were, reading through the book of Revelation to get the blessing. There was just one problem with this approach to Bible study. They had no idea what they were reading. They had no understanding. Have you ever had that experience? Have you been led, compelled to read through the book of Revelation, and then had that experience of saying, "I don't know what I'm reading"? If you have, then you know that God is working in your life, that He is bringing you to a hunger of truth. One day, people called on my mother's family, selling Christian books door to door. They knocked on the door and they said, "Would you like to buy some Christian books?" They said, "No, thank you. We have plenty of our own." "Would you like to study the Bible?" "No, thank you. We study the Bible regularly on our own." But then my grandfather said, "But we do have one question. We have one question. Can you tell us what is the seal of God and what is the mark of the beast?" We have one question. What is the seal of God and what is the mark of the beast? That's actually two questions, as Ken pointed out. Ken is quite precise. We just went through Bible study training last weekend. We were told what to do if somebody says, "What about some of these detailed things in Revelation?" What were we told? Any of you that attended? We're going to get to that. The problem was these people weren't going to get to that because this was their one opportunity. One question, can you answer it? Now, my grandfather was referring to Revelation chapter 7. You might like to just track with me if we're going through this. Revelation chapter 7. And if you... I'm going to take these off. Sorry, Stan, I know that. Every time I do that, he says, "You know, you really need to get some proper glasses." So Revelation 7 verse 3 says, "Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God." So there is some process where there are some angels that are holding back strife while some sort of sealing goes on. And then the rest of Revelation 7 is just fantastic. It goes through and it talks about 12,000 people sealed from each of the tribes of Israel, of the children of Israel. And then from verse 9 onwards, there's this beautiful picture of people praising God, an innumerable number of people praising God and the Lamb in heaven. And then at the end, right at the end, it says in verse 16, it's 15. This has got nothing to do with my sermon. I just love this. "Therefore they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will spread his tent over them." By the way, that is that euphemism for marriage that we talked about. "Never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat upon them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, their pastor. He will guide them to springs of living water. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes." Now, the other thing that my grandfather was referring to is in Revelation chapter 13. And maybe just flick over that and track there with me. Revelation 13 is divided into two parts. So Revelation 13 verses 1 to 10 talks about one beast, a beast that arises out of the sea. And that beast that arises out of the sea speaks great things, all sorts of prideful things, all sorts of blasphemous things. And then in the second part of Revelation 13, there is another beast that arises out of the earth. And this beast gives power to the first beast. And then it goes on through, where should we pick it up? Verse 16 perhaps. I don't know where to pick it up. 15. He was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that it could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. He also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast, or the number of his name. This calls for wisdom. If anyone has insight, let him calculate the number of the beast, for it is a man's number. His number is 666. 666. Watch out for 666. It's a mystery. Be wise. Find out. My grandfather had read the warning. He knew there was a second beast, a lamb-like beast that would force a mark on people. In verse 16, he knew the mark related to the beast's name and to its number. Interestingly, the seal of God also relates to the name of God. You know, the name. Do you remember, how many of you were here when our elders read through John chapter 17, Jesus' prayer for his disciples? It was beautiful, wasn't it? I love that prayer. And in that prayer, Jesus says, I have revealed what? That's good. I like that many-to-many communication. Feel free, more of you, to participate. What does he say? Well, I think it's John 17:3. I have revealed to them your what? John chapter 17. Where is that actually? Verse 6, that's right. Verse 6, I have revealed you to those whom you gave me out of the world. They were yours, you gave them to me, and they have obeyed your word. Does anyone have the King James version of that? Yeah? Yeah, what does that say there?
Verse 6, I have manifested your name to men whom you have given me out of the world. They were yours. You gave them to me, and they have kept your word.
Was he revealing just God's name? They kind of knew that. What was he revealing? The character of God. My mother's whole family was convicted that they didn't want the mark of the beast, but there was no one available to tell them what this mark was. It was a mystery. What were they going to do? They wanted to be sealed of God. They didn't want this mark of the beast, but who was going to tell them how to avoid the mark of the beast? What is the mark of the beast? This is a question that is of interest to hundreds of millions of people in the world. If you do a Google search for mark of the beast, you get something like 34 million Google hits. If you include 666, it goes up and beyond 250 billion websites. 250 billion websites. It's just ridiculous. So it's 250 billion, 250 billion websites. Awareness of and interest in the mark of the beast is widespread within society. For example, a few years ago, I saw Jay Leno joking about the mark of the beast. This wasn't some obscure joke that would be gotten by people who were detailed Bible scholars. This was something that was of widespread interest to and knowledge of a large portion of society. You know, a while back, I was presenting some evidence in a court case, and it was to do with the amount of damages against an accounting firm. Well, actually, the accounting firm was damaged, and we were trying to recover that. And I did the analysis, and the analysis came out that the damages were $666 million. So I presented that to the lawyers, and I said, this is what the analysis shows. They said, we've got to change that. There is no way that we are going to court seeking $666 million in damages. That is just not going to fly in a jury trial. So my grandfather wasn't alone in an interest in the mark of the beast and the countermark, the seal of God. I'm interested in mathematics. Do we have any mathematicians here? Yes? 666 is a really interesting number. So, for example, if you take a roulette wheel, I'm not recommending you take a roulette wheel, but those of you that know anything about roulette wheels, talk to me afterwards. If you take all the numbers on a roulette wheel and you add them up, guess what it adds up to? 666, right? Doesn't matter whether it's a European or an American one, it's either got 0 or double 0, they're still zeros, it doesn't change the sum. Those of you who know what a prime number is, what's a prime number? A number that can't be divided by anything other than itself or 1. If you take the first 7 prime numbers and you square them, what do you guess that it adds up to? 666. 2 to the power of 2, 3 to the power of 2, 5 to the power of 2, 7 to the power of 2, 11, 13 and 17. It's kind of starting to look like the Da Vinci Code. If you take 1 to the power of 6 minus 2 to the power of 6 plus 3 to the power of 6, guess what you get? So if you take the first 3 numbers, 1, 2 and 3, you take them all to the power of 6, you go 1 minus the second one plus the third one, you get 666. If you take pi, right, as random as a number as you could ever imagine, pi, right, 3.1417 whatever, and you take the first 144 digits and you just add them up, the decimal digits, what do you guess they add up to? 144, another biblical number. Well, we could go on, there's tons of stuff, but that's not what this sermon is about. What I'm trying to say is this is a number, 666, that really captures the imagination of the society in which we live. You know, a person who was invited by the Edstroms to the Shadow Empire program that we held for the public came to me afterwards and he says, see this voice of prophecy thing? And he showed me the mail-in card and he says, see the P.O. box number? Guess what the P.O. box number is? No, it's the down under version of the Mark of the Beast. It's 999. We see things up the other way. But the point is not that Voice of Prophecy is a demonic organization. The point is that here's somebody that notices it, right? 999 flipped upside down just grabbed their attention. The internet is full of things about who is the beast. Who is 666? You have things like Antiochus Epiphanes, right, from the time of the Maccabees. You have Nero, Caesar, who showed up in the Shadow Empire. You have Napoleon. Then you have essentially every pope in history is listed there with a whole lot of reasons why they are 666. John F. Kennedy. Anyone hazard a guess as to how many votes he got at the 1954 Democratic National Convention? You guessed it, 666. Ronald Wilson Reagan. Say it isn't so. How many letters in Ronald? How many letters in Wilson? How many letters in Reagan? Seemed to be attached in some way to a woman in red. Had a mortal wound, but was healed. Obvious, he must be it. Mikhail Gorbachev, got to be the beast, right, with that big mark on his forehead. Bill Clinton, lots of reasons why, but I can't remember them. Donald Trump, there is tons of stuff on the internet about Donald Trump and 666 at the moment. For example, his family owns 666 Fifth Avenue, which is quite an attractive address apparently, unless you're a Bible student. Trump Tower is 666 feet tall. It's actually 203 meters, and if you calculate that out, it's almost exactly 666 feet high. Although if you go and you look up Trump Tower on Wikipedia, it's been changed now. It's 202 meters high, which I would change the height to, frankly. My mother's family was obviously not alone in their interest in the mark of the beast. We just have one question: who or what is the mark of the beast? A conversation ensued, then Bible studies. God gets there first, doesn't he? When that coal porter knocked on somebody's door in British India, he had already been there to actually bring them to a hunger of greater understanding of the book of Revelation and of Daniel. The mark of the beast is not an obscure topic. It's something that literally hundreds of millions of people are interested in. Now let me ask you a question. Do we as a church have something to say regarding that widespread and deep fascination? Turn with me to Ephesians chapter 3. Perhaps we can help people understand something about this puzzle. Galilee, Phil Cole. Ephesians chapter 3. An understanding of the mark of the beast begins with an understanding of the seal of God. I think you have to understand God's mark before we can understand what the beast's mark is. And when I think about the mark of the seal of God, I would love to turn to Ephesians chapter 3. I think of the Bible as a tale of two cities. The Bible is, at its core, a tale of the city of Jerusalem and the tale of Babylon. The Tower of Babel, right in Genesis, and Babylon in Revelation. We've got Eden, which is essentially the original dimension of the New Jerusalem. And then we have the New Jerusalem in Revelation. And to me, the seal of God and the mark of the beast are really just parallels of this tale of two cities between God's city and Satan's city. Or relatedly, two pictures of God, the Babylon picture of God and the Jerusalem picture of God. So let's read in Ephesians 3, verses 2 through 5. Surely you have heard about the administration of God's grace that was given to me for you. That is, the mystery made known to me by revelation. So there's a mystery, right? This is the mystery that John the Revelator is talking about, and the one that my grandfather was grappling with. As I've already written briefly, in reading this then, you will be able to understand my insight into the mystery of Christ. What is this mystery? Which was not made known to men in other generations, as it has now been revealed by what? The Spirit of God's holy apostles and prophets. This mystery is that through the gospel, the Gentiles are heirs together with Israel, members together of one body, and sharers together in the promise of Christ Jesus. The mystery is essentially salvation, universal salvation available to all. Now in verse 12, if you skip down to verse 12, in him and through faith in him, we may approach God with freedom and confidence. Why? Why can we approach God with freedom and confidence? Because we're his children. But why? We were his children before when we couldn't. We weren't afraid of him. And what happened that made us not afraid of him? God revealed his heart in the person of Jesus Christ, and we were actually able to see that we can indeed approach God, that he is approachable, that he is love, and that he is freedom. In verse 14, for this reason I kneel before the Father. Right? What's he doing there? Worshipping. From whom his whole family in heaven and on earth derives its name. What's its name? Its character, right? The church derives its character from the character of God. I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the saints to grasp what? The dimensions, the magnitude of God's love. And it doesn't stop there. And what does it say in verse 19? That we would be filled with that same love. So there is some sort of settling process in our minds where we understand the character of God. We reflect it as we reflect God's character, our understanding of God's character, and then we too are filled with God's love. Ken? Yeah. Yeah. Our love is limited by our understanding of God. Isn't that so true? In verse 15, it said there about heaven and earth. For this reason I kneel before the Father, from whom his whole family in heaven and on earth derives its name. It makes us think back to chapter 15 of Revelation, right, where we see the whole of humanity, the whole of the universe bowing in worship before the Creator God. We see the same thing too in the three angels' message in Revelation 14. You know, the point here is that God is settling us into an understanding of his love so that we will be filled with that same love. Everyone ends up, in the end of time, living out their view of God in one way or another. If God is about force, then they are about force. If God is about freedom, then they are about freedom. If God is about requiring works of us, then we are about requiring works of us. If God is about faith, then we are about faith. If God is about seeking glory, then we are about seeking glory. If God is about self-sacrificing love, then we are about seeking self-sacrificing love. Flick over to Ephesians 4:30, which is what Ken read before for us, Ken Dovich. Ephesians 4:30, and do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with whom you are sealed for the day of redemption. What is the seal of God? What's that? The Sabbath? Yeah. Understanding the character of God. From what I can read, and I'm not disagreeing with you Vin, but from what I can see in Ephesians 3, the seal of God is the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives to bring about a full and complete understanding of the goodness of God. Maybe I shouldn't say complete, because we will be forever learning the goodness of God. In contrast, the mark of the beast is a settling into self-glorification. It's a determined desire to save ourselves. Remember the Tower of Babel, Genesis chapter 11. What was that all about? People trying to reach the heights of God. Is in Isaiah chapter 11, is it? Where it says, I will reach unto the clouds, I will be like the Most High. That makes us think about Babel. But it was also, at its core, it was an attempt to save through the works of one's own hand. The Tower of Babel is a physical representation of salvation by works, rather than salvation by faith in God. We can be gods ourselves, and that takes us right back to Eden, right, and the fall. Simply stated, the seal of God is salvation by faith in Him, and in a sense, the mark of the beast is salvation by works. Do you suppose that that was the answer that my grandfather got at the door in 1940-something? What do you think my grandfather was told? Vin's onto it. My grandfather was told that the mark of the beast is worshipping on Sunday, and the seal of God is worshipping on Saturday. Let me ask you a question. Who is right and who is wrong? Because that actually led my grandfather and my mother's family to become Seventh-day Adventist Christians, and this is why I'm with you today. What's that? It's all the light they had in those days. So, who is right? My grandfather or me? Yeah, that's right. God is truth. I am the way, the truth, and the life. But I'm asking you, through the gift of discernment, through the Holy Spirit, who is right? Depends. Believe in progressive truth? Yeah. What's that? Yes, I do. Absolutely. I think that it is at the... We're both right. You know, next week, I want to address this question. I want to leave it hanging, if that's all right. Is it possible that we're both right? In a sense, is it possible that we're dealing with symbol and reality? Will a day of worship one day have something to do with the seal of God? If so, what is the symbolism underlying the Sabbath? What, if anything, does the Sabbath have to say about salvation by faith? So what is the rest of the story? You want to hear the rest of the story? Just a little bit over time, but God got there first. That's really the story. My mother and the rest of her family decided that they would be baptized as adults. They'd been baptized as infants, but here they were actually deciding as adults that they wanted to follow Jesus' example in being baptized. God got there first. They decided that they would be baptized when they got back to England. When I say back to England, they'd never been to England. When they went home to England. But I think God knew that they would not have really made that decision. They would have started a new life and they would have forgotten that life. And so their papers to go to England just kept being held up. And there they are, a year and a half after partition, still dealing with the violence and the conflict associated with post-partition India, British India. Then finally, they scheduled a date for baptism in India. And that very same day, they got their papers to go to England. And the day that they had scheduled as their baptism was also the night that they were going to depart back to England. And just a little bit of a personal connection with this fellowship. John Altman and Alan Altman, their sister Denise McGee lived as a missionary in Pakistan in a home that was that home that my mother lived in, or stayed in that day of her baptism. And just before she passed away, she was able to talk to the McGees and talk about the people and the place and sort of relive that. And it was really neat to listen to that conversation. So on my mother's 21st birthday, she symbolized dying to her old life and starting a new life, and headed to England. After sunset that first Sabbath, as a Seventh-day Adventist, my mother carried a small bag with little more than a change of clothes. It had been her unfortunate job to take all of their keepsakes, all of their photographs, everything that was dear to them, out into the backyard and burn it, because all they could take was just one small thing. On June 11, 1947, my mother's life was beginning at age 21. And it began with one small question. God sent someone to an obscure British police commissioner in the middle of British India, because he knew that family was ripe for somebody, a Seventh-day Adventist, to knock on that door and answer their question, whatever that question was. Do you think that some of the hundreds of millions of people fascinated with the last day seal of God and the mark of the beast might actually be ripe and might happen to live in our own communities? Do you think that maybe their life would begin anew with us knocking on their door? You know, when you read in the three angels' message and it talks about Babylon, how does God refer to Babylon? My people. Come out of her, my people. They're not them, they're God's people. And we just need to go out and speak with them. You know, our church is going out to meet people who've been asking us to study the Bible. If you're interested to do that, speak with Ken and Jean Edstrom. Join Ken's Bible class on Sabbath morning. And I encourage you to go out and be part of this process of meeting with people where God has already gone before us.